in the coming years, we're going to see thousands and thousands more of space launches to deploy satellites and nanosatellites, to deploy constellations, as with Starlink, to go on these missions to the moon, or launch telescopes, or launch like intelligence or finding probes, stuff like that, like the James Webb Telescope, stuff like that, scientific instruments. The space economy is growing, and it's happening, and it's still kind of small, and we're all talking about it like, oh, it's going to, by 2030 this, or by 2035 that, and it could take longer. We don't know.
Yeah, I mean, 2030, that's 6 years away.
Yeah, and so it's like, it's one of these things. It seems kind of crazy until it happens. I mean, people were talking, if you were talking about Terminator-style killer AI 20 years ago, you sounded like an asshole, right? It was like, oh, you watch too much Terminator, buddy.
Right.
It's like, that's not going to happen. That's years off, maybe 100 years from now, whatever. And now here we are, and it's happening, and it's pretty much on the battlefield already.
My name's Jason Freert. Welcome to the Angel Research Podcast. I'm here with Jason Simpkins. What's up, buddy?
Not much, man. How are you?
I am doing great. It seems like every time you're on here, there's some sort of World War III has begun or is about to begin.
Yeah, there's always some new crisis, isn't there?
But now I'm like, no, it's not, right? Because it's not going to happen, and or like we've discussed before, it's already
pretty much happening. Yeah, we're already kind of in this kind of soft conflict with it, or even in some cases, depending on what region of the world you're talking about, that conflict is running very hot. I mean, you're talking about Russia's invading Eastern Europe, Iran and Israel are, escalating conflict there. China remains extremely aggressive out in the Pacific. But, they haven't attacked anybody yet, and who knows when that's going to be. But, like I said, wait for that to happen, Like, this is all just kind of...
Yeah, do you think there's, out of those conflicts, do you think there's one that's more likely that the U.S. would get involved? And we're already involved in all of them in various ways, right? It seems like we're giving Ukraine money and weapons. We're giving Israel money and weapons.
Yeah.
Are we giving Taiwan money and weapons?
We are. Yes, very much.
We're just kind of flying. We're just like, hey, we're here if you potentially need us, but China, don't do anything. So, like, is that just modern warfare now? Like, in this political environment, is just like we're not actually going to quote unquote, because basically, then if we go to war, the president is supposed to get permission from Congress, right?
Oh, yeah. But that hasn't been a thing for a while, really.
Right.
Because even back in, going back, I think, to the Obama administration, they were launching just full-scale drone warfare, and that never got
it's just operation.
approval. Exactly. There's all these ways of kind of skirting the law. Like, going to Congress to get, a ratified declaration of war, it would only be a formality well after the fact. I mean, we look at the way things move as quickly as they move. If, I guess if China did in fact invade Taiwan, let's take that as the hypothetical, then we would certainly act before Congress likely had a chance to pass any articles of war. And then I think you would only get that if ultimately, U.S. assets were jeopardized. A potential invasion of Taiwan would unfold a lot like the invasion of Ukraine, where we were already in Ukraine after Russia seized Crimea. We weren't there in terms of troops and boots on the ground the same way we're not in Taiwan in terms of really troops, and we don't have a huge military presence there personnel-wise. But we're in the region, and we have human assets on the ground, intelligence people and stuff like that, all forms of diplomats and people that do that kind of work that would be over there coordinating and orchestrating a U.S. response and U.S. aid in that event. And then it would be a matter of to what extent, how quickly, and what China's calculation was in neutralizing that support. If China felt like, we really don't have a choice but to attack U.S. ships, carriers, destroyers, that would be the kind of thing where you would see Congress pretty much immediately spring to action. and pass declarations of war and that kind of stuff, and it would be really the full blown kind of World War II type scenario where it's like articles get triggered. Does it trigger Article 5 of NATO now, where technically the United States has been attacked, so they must
Right.
come to our defense, and so they would have to then make that decision and hopefully.
Yeah, basically NATO could, I'm assuming, US has veto power in there, but if NATO decides to admit, Ukraine, then all of a sudden that's basically a declaration of war.
Yeah, so NATO has to be unanimous. That was one of the big holdups when they were bringing in Finland and Sweden. Turkey and Hungary were basically holding up the admission of Finland and Sweden for political concessions, and partly because they're more aligned. I mean, Turkey's kind of on the fence. They're such a hard country to read. But Hungary, certainly at this point with Viktor Orban, is more aligned politically with Vladimir Putin and with Russia these days than it is with the traditional West, with the Western powers in Europe, United States, and democracy in general. So, if anybody's going to get in, it takes everybody has to agree, and specifically because of that Article 5. I mean, if you're going to be like, okay, well, if this country gets attacked, we all have to go defend it, then really everybody has to be on board with that.
How much does the election in the United States play into what's happening now? Is there people that think, hey, maybe Trump's going to win and Biden is going to be out, so we better escalate this conflict before Trump gets in? Or do people think, hey, Biden is probably going to still be in there, so we can kind of, or let's chill a little bit? Or do you think people are thinking that, or it's just sort of naturally, organically happening?
I think it's probably I think those calculations are being made, with the election in mind, but not really. The interest is they're not really being defined by it. They're not saying, okay, well, this guy's the president now, so we have to act before say Trump gets in or anything like that. I think in the case of Russia, there's a sense that they're growing more aggressive, not just because they've put Ukraine on their heels a little bit in pushing back the front line, because Ukraine has lacked support, that it's to the extent that it's become detrimental on the battlefield for them, but because they sense that the United States and the West is basically flagging its support for the country. That goes back to basically the House failing to pass that supplemental aid bill that came up last winter and has just been sitting on the sidelines. If you're Russia, you're looking at that and you're going, well, let's ramp up now, because and it looks like, based on what I read today, it looks like that support is finally going to come along with aid packages for Israel and Taiwan and a little bit of humanitarian relief in the Middle East. It looks like, and it's already it's a minefield for Republicans right now. But it looks like Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, is going to floor that, and that's probably going to pass. So that aid's going to come. But I think if you're Russia, you're thinking, let's strike now before they get it, right? You don't want that. And if you think that the United States is losing its appetite for conflict or to support that conflict, or that you are going to get Donald Trump, who you could only be described as sympathetic to Russia and Vladimir Putin in the White House, then I think, yeah, you really would push for everything you could possibly get now and try to go on as far as you can. I don't think Iran or anybody like that. Iran and Israel just have their own thing going on right now. I mean, that's been going on for obviously decades. But like the last time we were on talking about this, we talked about the cycle of retaliation and escalation, and how we had the big terrorist attack in October, and that prompted Israel to respond. Well, some might say Israel over-responded a little bit now that they've killed 37,000 Palestinian people. But they definitely went even further and escalated by bombing the Iranian consulate in Syria.
Right.
Okay, so then Iran felt compelled to respond to that. So now last weekend they're launching 300 missiles and drones at Israel, almost all of which were shot down.
Yeah, it seemed. Well, Israel claims like basically it didn't do anything.
Yeah, it killed one person. I think it killed a kid, which is sad. But at least like in that kind of scope of that attack, to come away with like one civilian casualty and almost a complete neutralization of that attack is great. And it certainly tells you a lot about the defensive capabilities or Iran's maybe lack of offensive capabilities, or because either they really weren't trying to achieve anything.
Yeah, it was a
or they
bunch
were
of
just
missiles and a
incompetent.
bunch of drones
Yeah.
that came over.
They really didn't achieve much. But here we are this week, too, though, and now Israel, though, is still talking about responding to Iran's response to this
Yeah.
whole thing. And so we'll see what Israel does from here on out. But, that kind of thing is bad. Like I said, Israel bombed that embassy. They killed 2 Iranian generals. And that it signals, at the very least, a huge escalation in that conflict.
Right, and the market responded to this it was interesting. So, Friday, it's seemingly, it's April, was it 17th today?
Yeah.
Wednesday. So last Friday, the market was blood everywhere, seemingly because, hey, World War III might start or whatever. And then I guess even after it was weird is like Iran responded over the weekend, and then people were kind of like, oh, I guess maybe it's not World War III, and then the markets kind of came back again. So like, what do you cover the defense sector? So, in a way, like war and conflict is sort of good for those businesses. However, I would bet for the overall market, it seems to not want extended conflict. So what do you think would happen if there was to the stock market if it was an actual full scale war declaration?
It would crash.
Crash.
Yeah. If we're talking like that, if things really got out of hand, let's say again in whether it's China invading Taiwan, or let's say like Putin and Russia succeed in conquering Ukraine and then go, hey, let's go for Poland, like that kind of stuff. And that does trigger the war with NATO, and, or Iran does actually launch an effective attack against Israel and they come to blows, and it becomes a matter of this is serious, and now we're all getting drawn into it, and Russia's going to side with Iran, and the United States is going to side with Israel, and we're going to get into this whole mess. That's kind of a nightmare scenario for the markets.
It seems like there's been this stops, and people are they're ready to pull the trigger and sort of come back. We've seen gold run up to 2,400. There seems to be some sort of hedging against a large scale conflict, but I almost and maybe this is just me, it's just literally every other day you see WW3 trending on Twitter/X, and then it's almost going to be hey, maybe if it actually happens, then people are just not really going to believe it, or maybe, so, or like we said, there might not actually be a set time of being okay,
well,
now
I think
it is.
Too, yeah, like we talked about, a lot of that kind of trending stuff and more talking, it's gone less from it being, when people say World War III, it used to be kind of in anticipation of some future cataclysmic thing. But now a lot of times when you see it, it literally is simply in relation to all the conflict that is currently ongoing and expanding, and it is in fact expanding. Like we said, this thing with Russia isn't going away anytime soon. And when I'm floating hypotheticals of invading Poland, that's not coming from nowhere. That's what the former Russian president said. Okay, Dmitry Medvedev. They've said about all that. And it's not just specifically Poland, but there's a whole slew of Eastern European states, independent states that obviously used to be part of the Soviet Union, where it's Estonia, Latvia, all those countries, Lithuania. They're all very, very, very concerned about what happens if Ukraine loses. This is why, going back to Finland and Sweden, join NATO. Finland, you're looking at a country that, one, has been invaded by Russia before, numerous times even, and they've been a part of the European Union since 1995, but they just now joined NATO because they were kind of afraid of provoking Russia. They wanted to at least maintain some semblance of neutrality, to not be provocative in any way, and go, look, we're not going to join up with NATO. We're not going to join up, we're not going to just piss off Russia for the sake of tying this up. But it wasn't until Russia invaded Ukraine, they said, okay, well, now we better join NATO. So this stuff is coming from a place, and like I said, when we talk about the expansion of the conflict in the Middle East, it's the same sort of deal where honestly, like Israel at this point, we talk about it kind of overstepping and it's blurred some lines. When you're attacking a diplomatic building, a consulate in a third party country and killing civilians as well as, a nation's generals, that's that's different than just fighting the proxy groups that we talked about before, whether it's like Hezbollah or Hamas or any of these other kind of weird proxies that are in Syria and Lebanon and places like that. Now you are directly attacking Iranian interests in a way you weren't before, and it does open the door to Iran either, again, responding in kind like we saw, or taking the leash off of those proxy groups as it, which it had tightened over these past few months. One of the things about this whole conflict is that in the months after the terrorist attack in October and then the subsequent basically invasion of the Gaza Strip by the IDF were these attacks on U.S. positions. It peaked earlier this year when there was an attack on a U.S. base, and it was pretty bad. After that, they fell off almost immediately because the United States was able to communicate through back channels with Iran that, like, hey, this is a red line. You got to rein these guys in. You gotta stop. And all of a sudden, all those groups backed off. But now, when you do something like this, it's provocative in this kind of way. Now you're kind of inviting those groups to go, see, like, this is why. And now they're going to restart the conflict. And we've seen that kind of stuff, whether it's in the Red Sea or the shipping lanes and all those kinds of areas. We've had a proxy war ongoing for the longest time in Yemen. So there's all these things happening in that area. And it is a matter of, are Iran and Israel going to actually come to blows? And then what does that mean for the rest of the international community? And so I think people are just acutely aware of how close we are to the precipice as opposed to, these past years and decades where it was kind of a far-off thought.
Right. It's definitely not going to be a surprise, I guess, if that
it's more like you're slipping into it as opposed to it just like overnight. There's not a type of situation where Japan bombs Pearl Harbor or something like that. It's kind of like just tit for tat going back and forth. People like Russia, again, depending on the outcome of Ukraine and how that goes, and whether or not they feel like they don't even have an option in, like, saying, hey, since we're fully militarized, since we're already on a wartime economy, since we're already sanctioned and, we're already pretty much been made a pariah economically speaking by the West, and we've got our partners in China and Iran, and that's all we have, and they're not going anywhere, then we can keep up. Let's keep up with the belligerents. And again, I guess getting back to the point about the presidents earlier, then maybe if you do feel like you have a president, Donald Trump, who's not going to rush to defend, a country in Eastern Europe, then maybe you do keep going. Maybe you do start trying to pick off some of these smaller countries or start trying to, bully them or run the kind of hybrid warfare we first saw in Crimea where they more or less invade and have like a phony election and that kind of stuff. And you start playing those kinds of games knowing that you're not really going to be held to account.
Right. Let's switch up a little bit and talk about – I wanted to actually bring up Boeing because I think it was last time or the time before – you basically were not bullish on Boeing. And maybe we'll throw in a clip here of you talking about it.
I remember with Boeing, that was one of like years and years ago when I was initially putting together a portfolio of defense stocks. They were one of the companies I'd have into it because they're one of the big five. They're one of the traditional ones. They're a huge defense company. But I got burned the first time their plane started crashing. Like their first plane crash, whatever it was like 2018 or whatever.
Yeah,
the
first 737 MAX
down.
Yeah, where they just crashed it.
Yeah,
two of them.
Like, and then the second one went down. It was like, okay, well, it can't be with Boeing. And I never got into Boeing after that because I was like, this company can't be trusted anymore, which is insane because Boeing has been such a reliable company for so long. It's got like a 150-year history. It's an incredibly old, traditional, like very trustworthy company. But then it all of a sudden it just fell apart. And now you've seen all the problems it's had this year, and it's just stay the hell away
blowing
from
off. But it definitely was not something. It's been bad times for Boeing.
Yeah. And it's what was the latest one? Was it the when it wasn't the window on the Alaska airliner, was it? They had something else go
Well,
wrong.
the whistleblower
And
thing was a thing with the whistleblower like suiciding
Oh
himself,
my God.
and then we had the CEO basically stepping down.
Right.
But I mean, this was all after you had said, I don't know what's going on.
Right. Well, like yeah, because like I said, we know Boeing has been it's had its share of problems these past few years, going back to those first two 737 crashes in I guess it was like 2019, but it definitely escalated because the window blew out of the one plane. And then they had, I know what it was, they had to ground another. There was another plane that had to make an emergency landing. And because they had some issues and they found loose bolts in it again or something like that. And they were like, okay, well, it turns out, after like they did like basically a kind of a walkthrough of a lot of these planes, and it turns out there's a lot of loose bolts. And so Boeing's been in just a world of hurt forever. And they, like I said, they're one really big defense prime that I just won't touch with a 10-foot pole after the earlier set of problems. Like I haven't recommended it since 2017 or 2018. And then like they've had, I remember too, because like Boeing, the only thing you could say in Boeing defense is that like the problems I think really started in earnest in 2020 when the pandemic hit.
Yeah.
And so they had these mass layoffs. They had to lay off like over 7,000 people. A lot of them were engineers and mechanics. And
Bolt tighteners?
Yeah, exactly the type of people that would be doing that kind of work and like be overseeing.
We don't need these guys double checking these bolts.
That's what happens. You get these guys in the boardroom, they're like, where can we cut costs? Well, not in here, but I've got an idea down at the warehouse. And so they went and they got rid of all these guys on labor disputes. They also moved their manufacturing from like a lot of it from Washington State, Seattle, to I think South Carolina. They opened a new plant there because they were having problems with labor disputes in the union. So they really have just been a disaster.
So, I mean, that's my question. Is it so much of a disaster that the contrarian comes in and say, hey, maybe this is a potential turnaround story? We got to see, like, what's going to go on with the new CEO and all that.
The contrarian could have come in after their first two planes crashed 4 years ago and been like, all right, that was just a fluke. Right. Plane crashes don't happen nearly as often as auto accidents. This was just, you know, and it's Boeing. They'll get it together. And I'm sure there were a lot of people that did do that. I mean, after the first plane crashed, I myself said, I think this is going to be okay, for all those reasons. When the second one went, that's why I said, get the hell out of the stock. But, since then, it has done nothing to redeem itself. And like I said, now there's the change in management. I guess, potential. I just don't know why you would, because it's just there's so many other stocks you can buy that don't have these problems.
Right. It's one of those things like it's almost like Tesla, right?
Yeah.
You're like, I don't even know if I want to mess with this because Elon Musk is doing all this crazy stuff but it's supposedly overvalued, and let's just like you don't have to short it, but just you don't have to buy it either. So you can just
there's value plays and bargain buys that you can go out and find. There's plenty of risky stocks or turnaround plays that I feel like have less at stake. I'll throw a freebie out there because I just recommended one for the Wealth Advisory, which was Scotch Miracle-Gro, a company we're all pretty familiar with.
Okay,
right?
Fertilizer season.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty topical for being the spring season. But this was a company that really overextended itself because a few years ago, back in maybe I think it was like something like 2015 even, they really made this huge push into marijuana because all these states were legalizing, or they saw this legalization wave coming and they said, hey, we're a plant growing business. This could be really good for us.
Yeah.
So they set up this whole subsidiary called Hawthorne, and they started acquiring grow light manufacturers like fertilizer companies that deal specifically with pot and stuff like that, and all these kind of pot growing companies. And they really leaned into this pot subsidiary, but it completely backfired on them. That unit just kind of crashed and burned because marijuana itself has struggled to get footing. It's hopeful that, and again, not with respect to Scotch Miracle-Gro, because like I said, that unit they're pretty much trying to spin off or sell. But for the rest of the pot industry, it's like, okay, well, maybe this will turn around. Maybe they will finally reschedule marijuana, which is long overdue, because right now it's not only suffering from like being, still federally illegal, but there's a massive tax on it. that needs to be done away with. There's an oversupply of cannabis in the industry entirely. There's just entirely, I mean, depending
There's
on
too
your
much
perspective,
weed.
too much pot out there. There's so much. The prices
I
are
can
very
smell it.
low.
I can just
Yeah.
smell it when I'm driving around Baltimore.
Yeah, and so they leaned into this pot subsidiary, and that failed miserably. They kind of got away from Miracle Grow and Grass Seed, and so they're in the midst of trying to turn that whole thing around. And so the good news, I think they're going to do it. The telltale there will be on May 1st. They have their earnings report. That stock is up significantly. It's up about 40% since November. And if they do really well or even moderately well on that earnings report, it's going to go much higher. It was trading, I think it's trading for a shade under $70 now. It could be up near 100 in a short order if they actually are in fact making headway on this turnaround. And they had to do a lot of things. They had to sell off inventory. They had to address debt. They still have too much debt that they're trying to pay down. They took on all this debt to finance these acquisitions that didn't pay off. They're kind of working towards this turnaround. But that's a turnaround play I bought into because it's like, all right, well, if they are able to increase their cash flow, pay down their debt, get back to the basics, like they're doing. They started this whole new ad campaign, this like ad partnership with Martha Stewart, this product stuff, and so they're pushing their more traditional products. They're trying to get Hawthorne in line. They're doing all this stuff. They can turn around and just get back to selling grass seed, and they're going to do well for themselves. They'll
Right,
be
and
fine.
that's a company that's been around for a
You
while.
know, I don't see a ton of risk there. But then you go back and you look at a company like Boeing, and it's like you don't know when the next plane's going to fall out of the sky. So if
Yeah.
you're looking for turnaround plays, if you're looking for bargains, if you're looking to try to take advantage of these kind of fallen giants, and I mean Scott's Miracle Grow is crazy because it's been around since 1868. So like 3 years after the Civil War ended, there was Scott's Miracle Grow or Scott's, and then it merged with Miracle Grow in the 90s.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So that's a potential turnaround play, and maybe we should talk about a potential moonshot.
Oh, sure.
Literally putting trains on the moon.
Yeah.
So what's the deal with that?
So yeah, it's another thing. I talked about this with Jason Williams on the Wealth Advisory. It got some traction because it was an absurd story. But this is part of Northrop Grumman, so this is right in my wheelhouse in terms of defense contractors. And whenever I see a defense contractor doing something like this, I'm like, I gotta talk about this. And so what happened is DARPA went to Northrop Grumman and they said, we need you to conduct a feasibility study and tell us what it would take to put trains on the moon. And so there's a lot of stuff. I had it. It was they got to identify the resources that you would need, costs, the technological and logistical risks, do prototyping, identify potential problems with grading a rail line on the moon, long-term expansion, maintenance, and repair, figure out how to build it with robots. Like that's what you would have to do to build this rail line. And so
did they say what the rail line might be for?
So DARPA
just
has
like a moon base,
a handful of like moon-based and space-based initiatives that it's looking into. Now, this is part of the one that's called Luna 10, which is a 10-year architecture capability study to determine not just putting infrastructure on or around the moon, but actually offshoring isn't the right word, but putting manufacturing, being able to build things in space, being able to build space structures like solar arrays or satellites in space rather than launch them. Yeah. Like, let's say rather than, spend a bunch of money to launch a satellite into space, you just build it in space and then send it out there,
Yeah. Well, I know, not to get too much into the weeds on the material side, but I know some of these cutting edge materials that they are researching or are theoretical require manufacturing in like a zero gravity environment to get the molecules super in a certain configuration. It's it can't be manufactured on Earth. So you basically have to shoot something up there. And I don't know if the moon if they could still do it on the moon, but it seems like there's also there's not much gravity on the moon. So if you want to launch another thing from the moon, you don't need as much thrust from a
That's also
rocket.
True. I mean, there's a lot of reasons you would do this. And so we put this video out and the responses were...
No, what was weird is everyone was like, we need healthcare. I don't know what the healthcare. I was like, it's Northrop Grumman and DARPA. Like, that's not healthcare. Is not their. I guess the whole idea is that DARPA is taxpayer funded, right?
Yeah.
And so,
But that's just, I mean, and that it did crack me up a little bit, just like the sheer volume of healthcare responses of people being like, well, I need healthcare. And it's like, okay, well, all right, I can't help you with that one. Neither can Northrop Grumman or DARPA. You're right. Like we're not on this. We're doing something different. And I understand, like, there's taxpayer money. But at the same time, you could say that about pretty much any other taxpayer program.
Well, yeah, if you're going to come after something, it might want to be all of the money that we're giving Ukraine, Israel, and to defend Taiwan, because this study is probably peanuts compared to that.
There's a lot of things you could look at. If you want to go look for pork in the U.S. budget and then complain about not having a public option, you can do that. I mean, but that's just like the internet discourse, like that chatter. It's just like everything. But that's also, I mean, I think that's just like society too, and internet chatter and responses. It's like you could just say any innocuous thing, and then people will immediately flood. You could be like, man, I had a really good cheeseburger today, and then 100 people will be like, do you know what like the beef industry is doing to our environment with greenhouse gas emissions? Like, good luck with your cholesterol at your doctor. You know, it's just like, I need healthcare. Like, it's just like an insane kind of smattering of responses. But like I talked about the moon trains, and again, I'll talk about the moon trains more and about why we would do this. But I talked about it because I was like, overall, this is neat. And here we are always talking about investing and stuff like that, and it can get kind of dry. And I try to give our readers good, actionable investment advice, but I also do try to keep them interested, entertained, to talk about fun stuff.
Well, you have, I mean, a big part, you've been pretty early on the whole idea of like rocket stuff, right?
Yeah.
So you've had rocket. Is there any specific rocket/space stocks in your portfolio at the moment? I know you've had some in the past. Some have been acquired. And SpaceX is potentially going to go public at some point.
Maybe.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know what the deal is with that.
I think when Elon needs some more money, that'll probably.
But yeah, I do have space launch companies and space systems companies, and there is also a tremendous overlap, obviously, with the aerospace industry and with the defense sector, which is how a company like Northrop Grumman gets wrapped up in something like this. You know, like there's only a handful of companies that can actually tell you how to build a rail system on the moon, okay? And Northrop Grumman's one of them. So, you know, these are the companies.
Why aren't they asking the traditional
rail companies, BSNF, Burlington Northern Santa Fe? Go ask Warren Buffett. I don't know.
Maybe they are. Maybe they are.
I don't know. I think it's going to be just a totally different task. But, I mean, with the respect to DARPA, like I said, it's one of a few like initiatives they have with space. Another one's called Logic. They're trying to do like guidelines for just development and just trying to make rules and like set up a framework for what's really going to be an increased amount of traffic and commercialization of space resources and the space economy and the lunar economy. And again, I know this stuff does sound futuristic, but it's not just like the government. We're talking about like space development. There's a lot of people in the private sector and industry that are eyeing up the moon for one reason or another, either to potentially mine resources from it. There's water on it. We know there's frozen water on it, and that's a big thing in the scientific community. Is once they verify that there's basically these kind of grains of frozen water, of ice on the moon, that they can collect them, and then if you split, H2O, you split hydrogen and oxygen, you can create jet fuel. So they use the term basically like an intergalactic like gas station, that you would be able to take this stuff, and if you had the proper resources in space, either in outer space or on the moon itself, on the lunar surface, then you could create fuel there. And so if you were going to take a longer mission to a place like Mars, which is the goal for a lot of countries right now, and the main goal for a lot of space agencies, then you don't have to pack as much fuel on a ship, on a craft. So you can make a pit stop, essentially, refuel, and then get there, and then the same thing coming back. As well as there just being a sense of, like I said, kind of for scientific purposes as well as commercial purposes being involved. But then for all those same things, there's a very real sense that the moon and that it really what's called cislunar orbit, which is the space all the space between the Earth and the Moon is the cislunar, and we know that China has designs on strategically conquering this space. All right, starting with the cislunar space, which builds up from like low Earth orbit to medium Earth orbit, geosyncratic orbit, synchronous orbit, all these different levels. We know that China is trying to establish a military presence there. And I mean, obviously Russia as well, but this is really what's being seen as the latest kind of high ground in defense and security.
Literally.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's it. Like, I mean, for decades, the United States has wanted to maintain air superiority because it's always good to be up above, bombing down. Well, if you're up in space, firing down, all the better. And if you consider just how reliant the U.S. military and truly all militaries around the world are on satellite data, satellite imaging, satellite communications, then attacking and neutralizing your enemy's satellites in the event of a massive war is going to be huge. And we've seen that take place in terms. Target has been using its own defunct satellites for target practice. Russia is deploying what are called Gremlin satellites that basically shadow our own spy satellites, and we think they're going to basically use them to disable our satellites by basically ramming them or just kind of like hitting them in some way.
Well, there was a couple of months ago, was it they were talking about this national security threat, I guess, from Russia and like what, nukes in space?
Oh,
or
yeah.
like I don't know if they were saying an actual nuclear bomb, but like some sort of attack that they would use to disable our satellites.
Yeah, they never came out and explicitly said it, but
it was right when they were trying to get more funding for Ukraine. They're like, hey, wait, but they also might launch satellites, nukes into space.
Well, it's not that far off. I mean, right now, a lot of it and a lot of that capability, China's been doing it. Like I said, China has been deploying. You're not supposed to do it, but they there's
a lot of things China's doing.
Yeah,
that they're not
exactly,
supposed to do.
and that's the fear, and that is also the fear at the lunar surface. And China has its own plan. They have a 4-phase. It's actually more than 4 phases, but it builds up to manned missions, and then they want to build a base on the moon with Russia. Okay, and so China, like, if basically the thing about the moon is that if we don't do it, China will, because over the next few years they want to put manned missions. They want to put a man. China wants to put a man on the moon by 2030. And then 2035 and beyond, they want a permanent structure there that they're allegedly going to build with Russia or try to. In the meantime, they're conducting orbital missions, landers and rovers, and then returning samples and starting trying to like dig in as part of their own feasibility study to determine what it's going to take to put permanent structures on the moon. And remember, China was the country that was the first one to land a craft on the far side of the moon.
Yeah, that was relative. That was like a couple months ago, too.
It was a while ago. And so the moon, like we talk about the confirmed ice and water that's there, the fear is that China's going to get there, stake a claim, and then effectively say, this is our territory now. The same way they've tried to claim the entire South China Sea is theirs. The same way they think.
But we already got our flag up there.
Yeah, exactly. We already got there. So we think.
Yeah. They want to get up there and see if the flag's there. They'll get up there and they'll just trash the flag and see, like, see, there was nothing up here.
Yeah, this is our moon now. But yeah, or that they'll basically deny access for other, countries trying to do it. Again, for their own scientific purposes or for military practical purposes. So like there's a very real strategic competition now that has brought space back into the fold in a big way, and that's why we're seeing so many more, in addition to simply increase capability among rival and peer nations to develop their own space programs. I mean, for a while the United States had a monopoly basically. We're the only people who landed on the moon, obviously, but we were also the only ones really going in any kind of quantity, and we effectively stopped. And for a period, I mean, if you go back 10 years ago, there were maybe a couple dozen space launches each year. 5 years ago, it was up to like a couple hundred space launches each year. This year, it's over 1,000. And going forward, that's kind of the trend that's taken hold, is that in the coming years, we're going to see thousands and thousands more of space launches to deploy satellites and nanosatellites, to deploy constellations, as with Starlink, to go on these missions to the moon, or launch telescopes, or launch like intelligence or fact finding probes, stuff like that, like the James Webb Telescope, stuff like that, scientific instruments. The space economy is growing, and it's happening, and it's still kind of small, and we're all talking about it like, oh, it's going to, by 2030 this, or by 2035 that, and it could take longer. We don't know.
Yeah, I mean, 2030, that's 6 years away.
Yeah, and so it's like, it's one of these things that seems kind of crazy until it happens. I mean, people were talking, if you were talking about Terminator-style killer AI 20 years ago, you sounded like an asshole, right? It was like, oh, you watch too much Terminator, buddy. It's like, that's not going to happen. That's years off, maybe 100 years from now, whatever. And now here we are, and it's happening, and it's pretty much on the battlefield already. We're about ready to go with that.
Yeah,
so,
and it's just like the technology just constantly increasing.
And everybody woke up one day and said, oh, this is a thing? I mean, that was the thing. Like, I've recommended stocks. I have AI stocks in the portfolio that I had in as part of, the work they were doing with defense contractors. And, I mean, one was trading for $6 a share back in January 2023. By the end of last year, it's $20. Others were kind of the same. I will go from 15 to 30 because people just said, oh, AI is the thing now. And all of a sudden, everyone rushes into it. And it's probably going to be the same thing with more or less the space economy. Once there's kind of a critical mass, once there's a main inflection point and this stuff, becomes mainstream, that's when everyone just piles in all at once, and it's like, oh, of course. Like,
yeah, I think I mean, the SpaceX thing could be the trigger, because you talk about like Elon sort of being the pioneer with electric cars, and now, oh, everybody wants to be in electric cars. Once they're like, hey, he actually like did this with rockets and shit, and there's money to be made, like, okay, let's get in here now too.
There's dabbling. You see it with like the Fuji, the same way like a few years ago when all those billionaires were launching themselves into space. Like,
they're still doing it, right?
Yeah, Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos and all these, like, they're like, we're doing this now. We're taking space tourism, and that I don't know how commercially viable that is. It doesn't seem very, but at the same time, like, when we talk about what the military is trying to accomplish, what certain commercial interests want to accomplish and get out of space, and what they think they can do out there, then some of that stuff is very real, and it's all science fiction and it's all crazy talk until it's not.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm excited, and maybe they're using some back engineered alien technology.
Maybe they're reverse engineering technology. We don't know that.
We may well know. All right. Well, I appreciate you coming on the podcast.
It's always a pleasure, man. Love it.
And I appreciate the free pick, Scott's Miracle Grow. Check it out.
I'll sprinkle a few out there for you. Thanks for watching.
All right. Like, subscribe, and comment. Don't forget to comment about how we need health care. Okay. All right. Adios.